Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. I didn't want to say my usual intro where I tell them to shut up because that's quite rude, I've been told. So, I am Andy Gill. I'll give you my intro in a second. I'm here to present, so making sure you're in the right place. This is track one. We are the Friday the 28th of February, and hopefully some of you are maybe sober. This is Think Like an Adversary, using the red team mindset to aid blue in detection and response. And if you combine those things together, it says EDR, because I'm so smart. So, quick disclaimer before we get started. Because these are branded slides, I need to have a disclaimer of some description. So all screenshots in these slides, all attack paths are fictional. They're based on real world attacks, but they've been re-simulated in a lab environment. The Acme Corporation, for those of you who might not be aware, is from the widely, predominantly known Roadrunner/Wile E. Coyote animated shorts, also known as Looney Tunes, which was from the 90s. And guessed, based on the faces here, probably most of you weren't born when it was out. Okay, apart from this guy. So Acme comes from the Greek word meaning pinnacle, or the peak of greatness. So compromising environments that are peak. It's always fun. Bit of a quick intro about me. So that's clearly not me, that's my camera. I'm Andy Gill, I'm a principal consultant within CrowdStrike's Services Red Team. We have two red teams technically. We've got an internal red team that break all CrowdStrike stuff, and then we've got the Services Red Team that facilitate testing our clients. I've been working in security for about 14 years, maybe a bit longer than that. Started out working in risk, learning about governance, risk, and compliance, which at the time I thought was really boring and still is quite boring. But from doing it and then moving into kind of offensive security, I learned how to attribute risk to things and how to quantify that because you don't have this control and this risk is applicable, this is why it's a problem. I'm known as Zephyr Fish on the internet. I do frequent Twitter now and again, but I have kind of started to move off of Twitter over to Blue Sky because reasons. We won't talk about those reasons. So you can find me on Blue Sky, but my handle is zephyrfish.yxz.red because everyone loves random domains. I've written two books. They're both themed around security. The first one's very much focused on pen testing, so Learning the Ropes 101 and Learning the Ropes 102. The first one, like I say, focused on pen testing, focused on bug bounties. They're available on Amazon, or if you're a student or if you just like piracy, if you type into Google file type, PDF, and then the title, you'll probably be able to get a copy of my book. Because piracy, that's the one. I've got a second one as well, which is Learning the Ropes 102, Shock Horror. It's more focused around broader security, so it's got a deeper kind of insight into the different areas of security, because a lot of people want to get into the cool, sexy stuff, which is red teaming, but often the root end, and you'll find out from this talk, is actually if you learn about defense and building things first, you'll be a lot better at offense, and vice versa. I'm also a lab contributor for Zintra Labs, so while these are CrowdStrike branded talks, I do side work for Zintra. So Zintra are an organization that develop training for incident response. And my contribution, or my kind of role in what they do, is they take real world adversaries, so APT, 69, 420, whatever, and they take a scenario and I do the attacker techniques, and then the labs are you going through looking at the incident response after the effect. And I mean, I'm a bit biased, but I think it's probably one of the better trainings out there in terms of you get access to a lab, you get to see all the logs, you get to see what's happened, and you can also live fire when things are going on, so it's pretty cool. And finally, I was chatting to the photographer prior to this. I enjoy taking pictures of things and people sometimes. It's kind of my hobby. So that's my camera. For anyone interested, it's a Sony Alpha 7 Mark IV, and that lens is 24 to 105mm f4. So, enough about me. Quick overview of what we're going to discuss today, or what I'm going to tell you about. I'm going to give you an opening overview, which isn't this agenda. It really should say agenda and then open overview. I'm going to give you an overview of kind of the misconceptions around red teaming, the misconceptions about blue teaming, and misconceptions about collaboration between the two. I'm then going to walk through a real-world red team attack path scenario, which is based off of an actual real compromise, and it's been re-simulated in a lab. I'm also going to step through two case studies. First one being a process injection, where a user is compromised through a drive-by download, and then talk about the attacker and defender actions at each stage. And then we'll go through an insider threat or red team, and how to spot the differences and how difficult it can be. And if we have time at the end, I forgot to click play on my timer. Give me 2 seconds. If we have time at the end, I'll take questions. If we don't have time at the end, I'll be around if people have questions. And if there are questions that you prefer to ask me rather than ask in front of a group, that's absolutely fine. What I will say is that I can't talk about what happened in July, for obvious reasons, because I work for the company, and just generally bits and pieces. So, red team versus blue team. Bit hard to read. I don't want to make it completely dark. Blinded by the flash. Anyway, so CrowdStrike is historically known for its best-in-class, or one of the best-in-class, endpoint detection response tools, its intelligence team and its defensive technology. But we also do offensive security, and we offer that in the form of red teaming. And how we achieve that is we work with clients to assess their security posture based off of what we see in live environments from an intelligence perspective, and I'll talk about this a bit later on, different collaboration between different teams. The biggest misconception in red teaming is that it's always against blue. It's always like, oh, I get the flag, I get the goal, I get the objective, and it's like, oh, I win, you lose. But in actual fact, it's very much a collaborative manner because we're ultimately doing this to help better companies. If you can learn to attack something, which can a quick show of hands, who works in the kind of red sphere? Who works in the blue sphere? Quite a large proportion. So understanding how red thinks will allow you to defend much better, and it'll allow you to move away from that kind of linear, traditional thinking into a more kind of creative manner. So realistically speaking, you can't protect what you don't know about, and learning the attacker techniques from the red team and adversary-focused people helps to foster better technological understanding of how these attacks happen and how you can better defend against them. Ultimately, my methodology that I apply, I've applied it across a lot of my career, is if you focus on how to build something, you can then learn how to break it. Ultimately, you're then going to learn how to fix it, because if you find the broken things, you need to tell people how to fix them. If you understand that full chain, you'll also be better at defending against it, because where you might not be able to patch something, applying mitigating strategies like triage, detection, response will allow you to better defend yourself. So understanding how a system is built makes it far easier to understand how to break it, and ultimately that's how red and blue help build better solutions for customers. So I should probably preface this. This talk was given prior to, in November at CrowdStrike's internal conference called Falcon, which is mostly to customers. So a lot of the things I talk about in here, they're not exclusive to CrowdStrike as a platform. They apply to all sorts of EDR products and all sorts of platforms. While I will talk about Falcon, it's not exclusive. So, like I was saying earlier on, the misconception is that red is always there to win, always there to get objectives. But red teamers and businesses alike often see the red team as, we're the good guys. We're here to win all the things, and they often think that I'm just in offensive security for the purposes of offense. I want to get into an organization. I want to break these things. But in actual fact, we're doing, for the most part, offensive security for defense, because we're doing it to better understand an organization's security to help them be a better organization, to be more secure. Those that are doing offensive security for offense are the kind of research and development focusing on commercial implant kits where they're looking to break into foreign governments or build kits for espionage and those kind of things within legal bounds. There are grey areas, but generally speaking, we operate in the sphere of offensive security for defense. So, as we expand defenders' knowledge of attacker techniques and awareness, it's not always the knowledge of attacker techniques isn't always placed where you would maybe want it to be. So a lot of people that I speak to that work in the defensive sphere, are you going to blind me again?
No, stop.
Okay. I'm just looking down the camera like an actual psychopath. A lot of defenders' knowledge is kind of misplaced. And while it's useful that people that work in defense maybe go and learn the attacker techniques by doing things like OSCP or the CRTO or these kind of badges, they don't give you that real world insight into what the techniques mean and why things are the way they are. And if you look at it from like an IT perspective, so if you scale back from defense and look at it from like a sysadmin perspective, most IT staff don't know that why it's really important to have strong passwords on service principal name enabled Kerberos accounts. Kerberos thing being the attack there. Equally, a lot of IT staff, most of them, aren't aware that if you have a remote desktop session, so remote desktop protocol, RDP, disconnected, so not actually closed, but disconnected, you're leaving your credentials open for attack, where an attacker could maybe dump memory from the box, dump Kerberos tickets, and dump all sorts of credential matter. And then finally, a lot of IT staff, and a lot of defenders for that matter, are not aware of the absolute myriad of NTLM relay-based attacks. So where you can coerce a server to authenticate to you and perform additional attacks from there. You don't even need the credentials of someone. You can just do it unauthenticated. You can force a remote procedure call of a remote host, tell it to authenticate against you, and then you can relay that hash on to authenticate to something else. It's different from pass to hash that some people might have heard of, but it's called NTLM relaying. So the kind of purpose of this, at CrowdStrike, the banner is we stop breaches, and ultimately even the red team, because we're here for offensive security for defense, we're not here to play James Bond or waste your time as clients, or I suppose you're in general, we're not here to waste time, we're not here to approach kind of attacks for inefficiency for the sake of being cool. We're here to find actionable, real exploitable attack paths based off of things that we've seen in the wild. And ultimately, we're here to action collaboration to help build better strategies around security. Synergies, all that stuff. Almost swore. So, inter-team collaboration. This isn't exclusive to CrowdStrike. This is one of the things I've learned having worked for a vendor for about 9 months, is the ability to tap into these different teams. So starting from the far left, you know, got to get my right, right. We've got access to pretty good threat intelligence, where we've got cutting edge information into how threat actors are acting. And how does that help me as a red teamer? Well, if I know what adversaries are doing, I can help simulate and emulate those activities to help you as defenders kind of look at what this looks like. So if I'm attacked by this threat actor group and my red team are doing these techniques, then I'm learning more about how these are happening. We've got access to managed threat hunting and incident response. So tapping into the additional practical element of these breaches are happening. I get this information from these breaches. These are the tools that are being used. I can replicate what these threat actors are doing and then performing them inside environments. Obviously, CrowdStrike's an EDR vendor, so we've got the Falcon platform. We've got access to a lot of telemetry, seeing what's being used inside environments. Not just threat actors, but looking at like, what is IT doing? What is specific software doing that maybe might be suspicious, and how can I use that to my advantage? How can I blend into what looks like suspicious activity and make it look legitimate? And then finally, one of the things I'm going to hammer home throughout this talk is collaboration. One of the things I do throughout every engagement is I want to build a collaborative environment between the red team, the blue team, the customer, and I want to make sure there's deconfliction so that all the actions that are being performed for the purposes of the red team. And if there are any actions observed in the environment that aren't related, we can deconflict that pretty quickly. So that's the kind of spiel bit, but what actually happens in a real world attack path? So what I'm going to do over the next couple of slides is I'm going to talk you through a real world attack path that we've observed in a client environment. It's been augmented a little bit, and don't worry about trying to read the bits and pieces because I'm going to scope into each individual bit. I'm going to step through initial access through to actions and objectives, what the attacker actions are, what the potential defensive observations are, and how they can be combined for a broader understanding. So in this scenario, we compromise, as an attacker, we compromise the environment via phishing or prior data breaches. For anyone who was in the talk this morning about info stealers, a lot of information can be gathered from info stealers where those logs are available online. You can pull credentials from them and use them to authenticate to environments. That gets you your initial access. So in this scenario, we get initial access to a virtual desktop environment, a VDI, or virtual desktop interface if you want to be specific, as a standard user, which is Acme user. And from here, we establish command and control. So establish command and control can be done via a multitude of ways. In this specific scenario, maybe drop a binary to disk that is a legitimate binary, and then use it to dial out to a trusted site, so maybe a content delivery network like CloudFront, or Azure Edge, or Azure websites, something that's trusted inside the environment so it looks less suspicious. So I'm not going to malicious.com, I'm going to azure.net. And spilling Powerade all over myself. So defenders in this scenario are often quite suspicious. Well, I say defenders are suspicious. You should always be suspicious. You should always trust but verify. But when a binary is dropped to disk, a lot of defenders' mentality is, well, that's automatically, that looks suspicious. Like, why is user X dropping malicious.exe to disk? But that's not how these things occur. Usually what happens is that the attacker will drop a legitimate application to disk that's possibly backdoored, that's possibly calling DLL hijacking or something similar. DLL hijacking, where you drop a malicious dynamic link library to disk, and you have a legitimate application that calls that DLL, which allows you to execute code on behalf of the exe. So moving away from that mentality and looking at kind of broader view of, if this action is happening, what are the subsequent follow-on actions? And thinking of it from an attacker perspective, if you've got that access, what do you do? Well, typically we start to do a bit more reconnaissance. So on the endpoint, starting out looking at what's available, what software is installed, common things that you see on corporate environments. If it's a virtual machine, it'll have VMware tools. VMware tools, for those who are not aware, has 7-zip built into it. So you don't even need 7-zip on the endpoint. You can use 7-zip that's built into VMware tools to then use for infiltration of tools, so encrypted zip files, or exfiltration, encrypting data and pushing out the network. Equally, if there are defensive products on the stack, I don't even need to do any. If I get graphical user interface, so GUI access to the VDI, I don't need to even open up PowerShell or command prompt. I'm going to open up the Explorer, look at the C drive, what's in program files. Is there a security stack in there? Is Falcon installed? Is there additional logging? Is there instances where maybe sysmon might be there? That's building up a picture in my head of the environment that I'm up against. And that's without even opening up PowerShell. That's without even using WMI. That's without using the things that are traditionally attacker techniques or kind of traditional malware techniques. And once I've got a broader picture of the environment in this specific attack scenario, I'm going to start to look at what's around me. So this is when I might look to, rather than leveraging PowerShell or command prompt, leverage the C2 implant that I've got in the environment. So I'm going to start operating in memory. And if I'm a sophisticated threat actor, I'm going to start patching your security tools that are in place. So what do you do when you're blind? What if the anti-malware scanning interface, AMSI, is patched, or event tracing for Windows is patched, ETW, which multiple EDR vendors depend upon? What do you do when you're blind? Well, hopefully you're going to have alerts in place that say, we got telemetry from this box 5 minutes ago, and now it's gone blind, and there's all these suspicious actions that are happening on the network. Maybe you've got NDR in place, maybe you've got lots of other telemetry in place. So I'm building my understanding of the environment. I'm doing a bit more domain reconnaissance, and I'm starting to look for what's available. So starting from the endpoint, this attack path here, I'm going to abuse certificate misconfigurations, so Active Directory certificate services. Typically, that can be done in a multitude of ways. You can do it via dropping a sysinternals tool to disk called AD Explorer. For those who are unaware of, AD Explorer is a signed Microsoft binary, so it can circumvent some of the controls that are there. However, the indicators of compromise of that being used, when you use AD Explorer, there is a registry key that's set when you accept the EULA, so when you say, I agree to the terms and conditions. And for a lot of tools, that is an indicator of compromise. Now, there are ways to get around that. There's always ways to get around that. It's very much a cat and mouse game. But if you look at that and you see that this system is a VDI that's not used by IT users, someone dropping AD Explorer to disk should be a bit suspicious. But then the steps that follow that are even more suspicious, because you're performing LDAP queries where you're querying the domain controller for information. And if we're going down the path of active ADCS, we're looking at specifically certificate information. Is there PK init within your environment? So public key, I can't remember what it stands for, but PK init basically is used for certificate-based authentication. If I can find certificate servers, that allows me a potential path to privilege escalation. And with privilege escalation comes all the fun. So privilege escalation, I identify in the environment that there is an Active Directory certificate services server in place. There is a template called ESC1. Now, what ESC1 means is that me as a standard user, standard domain user, I can request a certificate and I can specify the subject name of that certificate to be any user that I want. And provided that that certificate has client authentication enabled and manager approval is, like, you don't need to approve it to be requested, I can request on any user that I want. So I'm going to go after probably domain admin, because why not? I want to become domain admin, I want to have the keys to the kingdom. And for a lot of pen testers that are focused on that, that's the end game. They've got domain admin, game over. Me, as a sophisticated adversary, that's stage 0. I want domain admin to start with, because that allows me to access all the systems in the environment. It allows me to go after specific hosts. I can do additional reconnaissance. I can do lots of things from here. So identify I've got ESC1. I request a template. I become domain admin, and then I impersonate the administrator. What I'm doing from here is I'm going to look for, like, thinking like a sysadmin, I'm going to look, what boxes does this domain admin have access to? Is there specific things in Active Directory that would indicate that there's privileged access management in place? So do you use something like CyberArk? Or have you got Beyond Trust? Have you got something else? Are there Active Directory groups that indicate that that's in place? And if so, how do I become in those groups? Can I add my standard users to those groups and then wait for a sync to happen? Or can I use my domain admin to authenticate to the privileged access workstation, for example? Or can I authenticate to the different systems? And in this scenario specifically, we're going to authenticate to multiple systems over SMB and RDP. So from a Defender perspective, you're looking at that and you're going, well, all of a sudden you've got a standard user that's logged into a workstation that has sent suspicious, well, not always suspicious, but potentially suspicious LDAP traffic to your domain controller. They're looking for specific things around certificate templates, which if you've got an identity product like Defender for Identity or Falcon Identity, or there are lots of other tools, I think Silverfort's another one, these will hopefully flag and then sometimes block the instances of that being requested. But if not, you step through and you go, right, okay, well, this has happened, we haven't seen it, but then all of a sudden there's a domain admin now looking at things from a standard box, where this VDI is not IT related, there shouldn't be any domain admins logged in. There's now Kerberos information as well, because that user's logging in, they're accessing things, they're doing queries, and thinking about the kind of next steps. So if you use your kind of adversary, your red team, your think like an attacker, what are you doing from here? So I'm personally the administrator, I log into a workstation and I start performing additional lateral movement. And this lateral movement involves accessing other systems, so credentialed access. Kind of what I was talking about earlier on, where you've got courses like OSCP and CRTO, they're very much focused on, I wouldn't say older techniques, but they're not so operational security focused. So one of the things that OSCP, it's changed now, but used to teach was use Mimikatz, dump LSAS. But if you're on a Windows 11 host, for example, LSAS lives in its own enclave, so you can't just dump LSAS, you need to do other things. And equally, because we're operating from C2 in this environment, we can do things in memory. But if we're loading things like the Common Language Runtime, CLR, for those unaware, CLR is used by .NET applications. Lots of tools in offense security use .NET because it's C#'s pretty great. It's based upon what PowerShell uses and all these things. So if I'm looking at that, suspicious processes are loading the CLR that maybe don't have the CLR, and what could be done from there? So in my attacking mindset, I'm compromising this box. I'm logging into admin wso1.admin.internal as the domain admin user. And from here, I'm looking at what users are logged in. So this box in question here, in this specific scenario, was a shared remote desktop system. So there was lots of users logged into it. And the users that are logged into it had lots of different processes. So the first thing I typically do if I get a remote desktop is I look at Task Manager. And I look at what users are logged in via Task Manager. I'm not doing anything malicious, I'm just seeing what's running on the box. And one thing that you can do, even without admin, is you can look at what processes are running as that user, and you can also see what architecture they are. Are they x64? Are they x86? And from there, you can start to tailor what attacks you're going to do from there. So if it's x64 and you're already operating in a 64-bit process, you can start to interact with that and have access to a lot more memory information. So I'm going to dump the web browser from specific users because ultimately in this attack path, I'm wanting to get access to the actions and objectives, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And the actions and objectives are to get access to additional systems, privileged access, mainframes, all that sort of stuff. So I want to go after those users. And what I found is that this client, or this environment specifically, has two users logged in, which is admin user 1 and admin user 2. Great naming convention. No, wonderful. And these users are logged in a browser to multiple different sites. So what I do is I using my access, I inject into memory of a browser, I become that browser process, I put my beacon into it, and then acting on behalf of that browser, I can then read things like the cookie data. And a little known thing from an attacker perspective is attackers often, they go after the cookie data, they go after the logins, and then that's that. But one of the things I like to do is I look through what are the bookmarks, what's in the history, what information can I gather from this? Because while the user might not be logged into, I don't know, some application, if they've got it in their bookmarks, there's a good to high chance that they access that frequently. And if they're in an Azure environment where they've got single sign-on enabled, I don't even need their credentials. I can just log in, go to portal.azure.com, access the application, and then pivot off to something else. And we'll talk about pivoting in a little bit. So once I've got the browser credentials, I'm then looking to do additional attacks. Like I was saying earlier on, domain admin stage 0, this is us moving across the environment, moving quite quickly. And as a defender, you need to be aware of these things and thinking about kind of the broader attack path. So my ultimate actions and objectives here is I'm looking for privileged access. I've already got domain admin, so that's my kind of stage 0, domain admin. I've gone from zero to hero, essentially. But my privileged access here is I'm taking the admin credentials and I'm using them to access all these different systems. Now, because this is an adversarial focused activity, typically what clients want is they're like, oh, we want to see what the impacts of ransomware are. Well, from my perspective, I now have access to your backup infrastructure. And if I'm a bad person, like I'm not, well, I like to think I'm not a bad person, I'd be deleting those backups. The first thing I'm doing is deleting those backups. And then I'm going to drop stuff to disk, and then I'm going to ransomware the environment. But because this is a controlled environment, and we're the good people, we're not going to delete things, we're not going to encrypt things, we're not going to do that, we're just going to show that we've got access to it. But similarly, we've got access to mainframes. Now, I asked for a show of hands at the start who was born before 2000. Does anyone know what a mainframe is? Has anyone been on a mainframe before? Yeah, they're horrible, but also, having compromised them in the past, there's not much documentation online about mainframes, so you need to be really careful. But because I'm an attacker, I don't care, I'm just going to delete that. And there's your banking system. So I've got access to that, I've got access to Azure, and ultimately I've got access to password vaults. So privileged access management is great in principle, but if I've got domain admin, I've got access to all the systems. If your PAM system is domain joined, then you've got other problems there, and I've got my actions and objectives. So with domain admin, there are so many different attacks that can be done. I can create new users, I can modify existing users. One of my favorite things to do that slips under the defender's radar is pick a user in Active Directory that's got not quite domain admin, but decent enough privileges, and clone them. So you've got user 1, and I'm cloning user 1, and I've got all of user 1's privileges. I can go and access the systems that they're using, I can create my own password, I can do whatever. And for the most part, there's a lot of defensive tools that slips under the radar. So from this attack path, what have we learned? So adversaries, this is really dark, so you probably can't even read it, but adversaries only need to be right once, and you collectively as the room, Blue needs to be on it every time, and together in collaboration, we help evict adversaries and stopping them in their tracks. How are we doing for time? Half an hour, wonderful. So the next one is a case study. This is actually a real world attack path that we observed in an environment, and it's all of the information shown is fictional. You've used the example IPs, etc. But this specific case here is all about pivoting, and pivoting from the perspective of an adversary pivoting off of systems, but also pivoting from the perspective of a defender, where you're pivoting off of information you've got and expanding your investigation. So we're kind of understanding all the kind of broader picture and pivoting to build the puzzle. So this is the attack chain end to end. I'm going to step through the different scenarios. Similar to the previous one, we've got resource development through actions and objectives. This specific attack path scenario is where a user is compromised using NS 15077, which is probably a not very well known number. Basically, that's a vulnerability in the Adobe font driver, where the attacker loads it into the browser and they can achieve privilege escalation from the browser. It affects, or in this instance specifically, it affected Windows 7 and Windows 2008, so it's not so prevalent, but it does affect different environments. So stepping through the different phases, as an attacker, before I even get into the environment, so this is like stage 0 through to attacks and objectives. I'm going to start out with my resource development, and during that time, I'm going to start to build exploits. I'm going to look for available CVEs, I'm going to look for available exploits, I'm going to look for misconfigurations in your perimeter, even before I do the attack. So if we apply this to red team scenario, it might be a case that you've got maybe like a 8-week, 16-week engagement, and you're spending the first 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks doing preparation. You're not going to run in head first. You want to have enough information about the environment where you can dive in and learn about what you're going after. So as the attacker, I'm developing my exploits. I'm compromising legitimate websites. So because this is based off of what an adversary did, in a red team, typically kind of legal, there's legal boundaries where you can't go and compromise legitimate websites, but attackers don't mind, threat actors don't mind. So we compromise a legitimate website, we inject malicious code to that website, so if your users are browsing to that website, we're performing like a watering hole attack, where we're injecting malicious code. And this is paired up with SEO poisoning, so search engine optimization. You might find it yourself outside of doing security, where you search for something and you get suspicious looking websites that advertise that they are what they say they are, but they have multiple redirects. That's typically SEO poisoning. Then ultimately, everyone's favorite, phishing. So once we've done a resource development, we're then going to move to force the user into doing something. Because while it can be nice to have passive exploitation, where we get the user, we get them to browse to a website, and then they download the malware, and then we're all happy, sometimes you need to force the user to browse the compromised website. So that's achieved via phishing, but that can also be achieved via like general social engineering, where you're calling up. Quite more and more common is getting voice-based phishing, so phishing calls where people are calling up saying, "Oh, this is the help desk, your laptop's out of date," or whatever. In this specific scenario, we saw that a threat actor had spammed a user with thousands of emails. I think it was like 10 or 15,000 emails, and then immediately called them up saying, "Oh, this is the help desk. We've seen an influx of spam. We need you to follow our information." And what you've got there is your users immediately hooked, because you've got all this spam. Someone's calling you up and saying, "You've got all this spam. We can fix that for you," and you're immediately hooked. So once you've got the user hooked, they click on the compromised website. This is where the kind of privilege escalation and attack happens. So from an attacker perspective, the vulnerability here is that the malicious link loads a driver into the browser. And what that allows the attacker to do is go from being a standard user to becoming system. Now, I'm not going to walk through the exploit in depth because it's out width of my wheelhouse, but at a high level, that's what happens. And then once they've got their privilege escalation, they become a privileged user, they've got system on the box, they've got access to what else is on the system, they're then looking to actions and objectives. So in the previous scenario where actions and objectives was gaining access to privileged systems, this here is very much focused on data exfiltration and destructive actions. So much like deleting acme.backup, we're looking at what other data exfiltration can happen. So the browser in question, the user in question that was targeted in this instance works in finance. So the information we're looking for is financial data, and then we're going to package that up and exfiltrate it to the environment. So from a defender perspective, what actually happens at this point? Like what are we interested in? Well, we're looking at suspicious drivers that have been loaded by the browser. Maybe the browser's out of date. Maybe we're running an outdated version of Windows. Maybe there's suspicious actions from the browser being the parent process, injecting into the child process, and then further horizontal movement between processes. And I'll show a diagram shortly that will explain that. Equally, from actions and objectives, the detection opportunities are pretty broad when it comes to data exfiltration. I say pretty broad, it depends on your defensive stack. So when it comes to data loss prevention, there are few solutions out there that work well. And I say that because you can get data out of an environment using any number of protocols, and the common ones that DLP solutions tend to block are things like HTTP and POST requests, and sometimes DNS, and sometimes FTP, and sometimes SSH. But the thing with DNS, there's a kind of it is a new technique. There's a technique called data bouncing. And what data bouncing allows you to do is package up data in lots of different sub-DNS requests, and chuck them to CDNs, content delivery networks, and then push them out the environment. That's impossible to detect. So that's that. We've got the action objectives. The destructive actions, if you're spotting people deleting things, probably a bit suspicious. Hopefully a bit suspicious. So the data points. From a blue team perspective, I'm conscious we're running quick through time, but from a blue team perspective, the data points that will help, so the things that you generally zone in on are what user's been compromised, what IP addresses is the source IP, what's the destination IP, what am I accessing, what domains are there, like what is being called out to. So when you click on your malicious link, is it malicious.com? Is it an Azure endpoint? Do we use Azure in our environment? Does this look suspicious? We're also looking at like hashes of files. So if there's a driver being loaded, is there a hash for that driver? Is there files being dropped to disk? And how can we gather information? Then if we broaden out our perspective and look at more information, what software is on the endpoint? Do we have an inventory of what's on the endpoint? Do we understand that, yes, it's a Windows system, maybe it's Windows 7, it's an accepted risk, because everyone likes accepting risks. You know, GRC, all that fun stuff. Do we have events from EDR telemetry? So if you're great enough, not great enough, basically if you're privileged enough to have EDR in your environment, do you have additional telemetry from the environment? Is there potential instances of tokens being stolen? Is there potential instances of further process injection? And are there additional login events? So once the user gets system, are there other users logged in? And if we look at it from the red team perspective, which is where the kind of adversarial mindset goes, that's cool. You've got the username, you've got the IPs, but what about the cookies? Like I talked about earlier on, what about the other websites they're logged into? Are those websites, do they belong to us as an organization? Are they third-party websites? Could those be used for further attacks? One of the things I love doing, it's a bit of a grey area now, but basically I would compromise a user, get into their browser history, look at what third-party services they've got access to, and then use them for further phishes internally. Because if you trust say Salesforce, for example, you can send emails to people, and if you use Salesforce internally, chances are it's on a proxy allow list, chances are it's on an inbound allow list, chances are you allow list no reply at salesforce.com, for example. I can send payloads that way, or if I use DocuSign or something else. You've got these applications on an allow list somewhere, and they allow me further entrenched access into the environment. But then if I move away from the browser and I move away from the additional information, what other users are logged into the system? What Kerberos information is there? Are there services in there that I can steal Kerberos tickets for and access other services? What historical credentials are on the box? So one of the things, it's not so much applicable to Windows 11, but Windows 10 and previous versions, like Windows 7, for example, will often have cached credentials, sometimes in the LSAS process, sometimes LSA secrets in registry. And I can dump that information as an attacker, and I have instantly potentially access to additional NTLM credentials that I can use for pass to hash. Additional credentials for service accounts that maybe are in clear text if they're wrongly encrypted or wrongly used. Or if I have DCC2 hashes, which is what LSA secrets are held as, I can crack them offline. And if you've got a poor password policy, or you've got like a default setup or something else, that's a potential attack path for me. And the kind of key one here is, what other defensive controls am I up against? Yes, there's an EDR on the endpoint. Do you have logging? Like, have you got something like a Splunk forwarder in place, or have you got Tanium or something else that's forwarding your logs somewhere? Do I need to be cognizant of that? Do you have indicators in maybe the root of the C drive that you've got PowerShell logging enabled? Do I need to be conscious of that as well? Are there things like suspicious DLLs in processes? Maybe if I open up Task Manager and look at the command line for a certain tool, maybe it doesn't match up what I'm expecting to see. And going back to the mentality earlier on of understanding how to build something, if you look at what something is meant to look like from an attacker, and you want to blend into that, you want to take the command line usage and blend into that. So the kind of detection response life cycle, we've talked about the attack life cycle, detection response. This is kind of the bread and butter for a lot of people. Typically, when working at detection in an environment, so this still taking the browser compromise, we're looking at the detection in the environment. We're looking at, is this hands-on keyboard activity or is it automated? So when the user clicks on the thing, is there, when they click on the link, is there automatically someone, malicious operator using things, or is this all automated activity where the malware downloads, it automatically injects or just do other things? Or are there indicators where people are mistyping commands or doing other things? Or maybe they've got a different keyboard layout, and then you can start to attribute things that way. You then move across to your response. So should I be containing the host? If I'm observing that there is malicious activity at this endpoint, what's the endpoint used for? Is it an operational technology host where if I contain it, we're talking factories offline? Is it a domain controller? If your users are logging into email or clicking on things in domain controllers, you've got bigger problems. But is it a domain controller? Am I looking to contain it? Should we be looking further back at historical data? Have we got look back information as to, does this user regularly receive emails from this domain? Should I be blocking the domain? Should I be looking for additional subjects? Should I be searching across the environment for who else received this email? What other hosts are potentially in scope for this, or potentially being targeted? What's the potential impact from here on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data? Fun fact, I was chatting to a client the other day about CIA, and I was like, oh, what does the A stand for in CIA? And he went, agency, of course. And I'm like, that's the wrong CIA triad. So, yeah, do you understand what the acronyms mean? Moving around to kind of investigation. So, being kind of in the investigative point of the activity, what process is being targeted? What information is being targeted? And how can you leverage that information to understand more about what's going on? And then finally, wrap up. So once you understand how the attack path has happened, what do you do then? Do you learn from it? Do you pass that information to other teams? Maybe you've got a threat intelligence provider. Maybe you have an in-house threat intelligence team. Do you pass that information off to the TI team and go, we've seen these indicators are compromised. We've seen these domains. We've seen these IP addresses. We'd like to search this across. Maybe you're an MSSP. You want to search this across your client base and say, well, actually, client X has received this email, client Y has received this email, and client Z has got a similar email, but it's a similar attack chain. You can start to look at attribution. Do we have clients that are in specific areas, like specific sectors that are being targeted by these things? So if we're looking at operational technology, maybe it's manufacturing, maybe it's retail, these kind of things, starting to build that attribution and that understanding, and having a deeper, having a broader threat intelligence understanding allows you as a defender to look at what if this happens again, and how do you respond to it? So technical details. Everyone loves technical details. So diving into investigation, from this specific attack path, I've got a laser pointer that I found out at the start of the talk. I'm not going to blind anyone, don't worry. Well, I'm going to try not to blind anyone. So here we've got this attack path here. We can see that Google, obviously Google used to build Chrome. We've got a version here that is very out of date, and this is the hash of the version. So the hash of the version is useful because it might be that the attacker is loading a different version of Chrome, maybe a portable version, maybe a portable version of Firefox or something similar. We've got the release date of this is 2023, so there's multiple CVEs that we're up against. There's multiple vulnerabilities and misconfigurations in this browser. There's not additional security controls, maybe it's missing like certain enclave features. And then we're looking at the events of when the user clicks on the link. So we've got a driver load event here, which is Adobe Systems, and this is the path to the DLL that's been loaded, specifically the Adobe font driver. And then if we look up what the what vulnerabilities are associated with Adobe, there are lots, but in this specific instance, we've got the font driver. Looking up what those vulnerabilities are attributed to, we've got privilege escalation, we've got, well, if the driver's loaded, what can be done from there, and then stepping on from that. We also find that this host in particular is Windows 7, and this font driver is associated with Windows 7, Windows 7.8, so we can start to kind of understand what the operating system level vulnerabilities exist, and if the attacker is pivoting away from compromising the browser and compromising other hosts. And then finally, we've got the age-old. We've seen the operating system version. It's Windows 7. That's a problem. It was released in 2009 and unsupported from 2020. Now, there is extended support, but as these things happen, it gets a bit dicey. So if we look at defense evasion, and this process injection in particular, this was the MITRE number as of November. It might have changed, because MITRE changed because it's a bingo card. I love MITRE, they're great people. So from a defensive perspective, this is the attack chain. So the driver's loaded, and immediately we see instances of process injection from the browser where we're injecting into CRSS.exe multiple times, SVC host, and CRSS again. So the attacker, put my attacker hat on for a second, we've pivoted away from the browser because we are performing process injection to move away from the initial browser process so we can establish additional reconnaissance on the machine. So I'm going to inject into these processes because they tend to be privileged, and because I'm already system, I can access things like LSAS. Now, LSAS, we all know, is where credential matter lives. So if I inject into these processes, it's a little bit less suspicious of these processes opening handles to LSAS than it is Chrome opening a handle to LSAS. And with a handle open to LSAS, I can then obtain additional credential matter and move to other systems that way. You've then got other injection points. So here you've got Node. As an attacker, typically, or from a operating system perspective, if you've got processes that are calling out, so they're loading the wininet.dll or winhttp.dll, which are used for internet communication, if you've got SVC host or CRSS that's loading it, it might be a bit suspicious. But if you've got Node, which is a known web framework that makes web requests, you loading that DLL is not going to be as suspicious. And as attackers, you should be looking at, as defenders, attackers, defenders, same thing. As defenders, you want to be looking at what DLLs are being loaded, why was it loaded, is Node even used in this system, or is it brought in as a portable binary, and are there additional attacks from there? So if we deep dive the process injection, specifically, we've got executable bytes in the shellcode that's been loaded from when the user clicked on the link, the payload was loaded into memory, and the attack was done. So using my favorite tool, CyberChef, we can take the hex data and then we can decode it using UTF-16 LE. And this decodes to this nice path here. So what this shows us here is that the tool, the attack, the shellcode is loading task host, which is loading the win inet DLL, and it's making a request to this IP address here with this this friendly.jpg. What this actually is loading a malicious piece of software in the form of a JPEG, so extension smuggling, and pulling in additional C2 to perform additional lateral movement. Like I said earlier on, this is an OVH host. This was made for the purpose of this, so you can go and look up the IP address. It's nothing sexy. It's just OVH. So detection response wrap up. This isn't the end. I've got another attack path. We've got 15 minutes. It's great. So with Red's input, what further actions can we take? So if we understand the lateral movement that's occurred, if we broaden our understanding of the environment, this attack chain has happened from the perspective of we've injected, or the attacker's injected from the browser, and they've accessed other systems. What cookies, like I love cookies, they're great, but what other cookies are in the browser? What additional attacks can be done? What additional telemetry have we got, and what telemetry are we potentially missing? Because while we might not catch this attack happening, what if the other users have been targeted? If you turn that additional telemetry on, you can get additional information, and then you can go and triage that additional information. Finally, once you've got a broader understanding of the attack path, how it's happened, you want to package that information up. You want to gather all the indicators of compromise. Maybe you want to apply deny lists across your environment for specific hashes. So like if the font driver is being loaded and you don't use it in your environment, you probably want to add it to deny list. You'll probably want to block the domain where the payload is being hosted. You probably want to block the C2 domains, all these sorts of things. Once you've got that information, you want to chuck it off to your threat intelligence provider, your threat intelligence team, who can use it in more kind of a broader sense, and they get a deeper understanding. So, next case study. I love this meme. I use it all the time. Not specifically I am the insider threat, but I just use it for everything. And when I gave this talk at Falcon last year, my talk went through legal, I went through marketing. And I had marketing, just a quick tangent, I had marketing and legal on the phone. And marketing were like, yeah, memes are fine. And I was like, just to be certain, guys, you're fine. Legal were like, yeah, it's fine. What's the worst that could happen? And I'll flick onto the slide, and I went, yeah, I'm sure it's probably fine. Yeah, it'll be fine. I'm like, okay, cool. Got the big thumbs up from legal, so yeah, I'm allowed to use great memes. I think it's Captain Phillips it's from, it's great. Look at me, I'm the insider threat now. So, insider threats and risks. They can be quite difficult to spot. And as we're seeing more and more in client environments in general, lots of clients are opting for the less traditional approach of a red team where you're starting from the outside, you're phishing in, you're getting access, and they're looking at more assumed breach scenarios. So what happens when your user's already clicked to the link, you've already got initial access? What do we do from there? Or even better, what happens if you've got an employee that goes rogue, that is maybe an accidental insider, where they maybe don't know they're doing malicious actions? And what do you do from there? How do you differentiate between what your baseline looks like and what your users are doing? So, for initial access to actions and objectives, from an insider threat perspective, and this is where your traditional red team / adversary / kind of OSCP mindset kind of differs, because you're not doing exploits as such. It's important to drink. I've been talking like straight at you for 40 minutes. So, looking at common tactics, techniques, and procedures where you've got your initial access and you've got in the box. So if you want to simulate an actual assumed breach, you want to use those actual TTPs that are being used. So maybe you're starting from the perspective of a malicious binary on disk, and you're looking at, well, what understanding have we got if this random exe appears on disk and it's doing, I don't know, a web request, for example. Equally, we want to observe angles that are not generally considered from standard attacks. So your mentality is, well, we're getting phished, so we're getting suspicious attachments. But what if a set of user credentials are being compromised and they're logging into a VPN from not a foreign nation? They're logging in from the UK, for example. Maybe they're using residential IPs, where they're logging in from, maybe it's a working from home user. That's much more difficult to spot. So as an attacker and as a red teamer, I'm going to start to use those techniques to blend in with general traffic. What I also like doing is I like spying on people. Like, I've got my camera, I like taking pictures of people. But no, I mean, from a perspective, not going back to Tia's talk earlier on, because that's totally different. Anyone watching the recording, Tia's talk wasn't recorded, so you don't know what I'm talking about, but it's fine. So yeah, you're using. I like to spy on people, and what I mean by that is I like to watch what standard users are doing. Not every user is going to do malicious actions. They might be logging into SharePoint, they might be accessing shares, they might, when they log into an initial box, they might have a home directory that maps, and maybe that home directory is mapped on a central file share. What does that central file share have? And do I have recent documents that have been opened? Now, if the user has been created fresh, it can be quite difficult to emulate that activity, but equally, the benefit of having a fresh user as well is you probably don't have a baseline of what that user does. Like, what department do they work in? What do they have access to? What are these things that they're doing? But then if I'm looking at lateral movement, so I've got my standard user, I'm inside the environment, I'm now an insider threat. I am a risk to the organization, that's what I'm emulating. I'm going to perform offensive sysadmin techniques. And what I mean by that is I'm going to use legitimate applications. I'm going to look what's on your sysfile. Like, have you got scripts that you use for deploying Windows hosts inside the environment? Have you got sysinternals tools? Like, quite often in client environments, I find that sysinternals is used quite extensively. Sysinternals is a suite of tools for helping sysadmins do sysadmin things, like AD Explorer that I talked about earlier on. And if AD Explorer is used in your environment legitimately, and if you don't have detections, or maybe it's a noisy detection that EULA alert's firing, I'm going to use that for illegitimate purposes to map it Active Directory. I'm not using Bloodhound, I'm not using any of that information, I'm using legitimate tools to map it Active Directory. So once I've got those tools, I'm then going to look at what additional information I can get. Have you got deployment scripts? Like, do you use SCCM, for example? Do you use Intune? Do you use these things for deploying boxes? SCCM, personal favorite of mine from an attacker perspective, because SCCM comes with a litany of information. You deploy .wim files, which are images of Windows hosts. Now, if you don't have like LAPS in place, local administrator password solution, which essentially changes the admin password on a frequent basis, if you don't have that in place and you deploy a WIM file, which is an image of Windows, that often has the SAM system security file hard-coded into it. So as an attacker, as a standard user, you can download that WIM file, unzip it with 7-zip. Great, if you're on a VMware host, you've got 7-zip already. You unzip the 7-zip file, you pull out the SAM system security, take them offline, use something like secrets dump, you've got the entity name hash of the administrator. You've now privilege escalated without doing anything hacky as such. You've just accessed files. So those techniques are things that are hard to spot. Because what have we got there from an attack chain? Well, we've got a standard user that's accessed a share that they've got access to that's not suspicious. They've used a tool that's already on the host, so they've got 7-zip, they've used VMware tools, and they've just opened an archive. And then they've uploaded those files, or maybe they've copied them out of the RDP session. Yes, you've got those potential RDP logs of the file being copied, but it's less suspicious. But then if we move on to credentialed access, the observability of odd behavior. So if I'm emulating, if I'm spying on this user typically operates on UK time, so they're operating 8 till 5. Maybe they're working a bit later, maybe they're working till 6. I'm going to wait till their RDP session goes idle, and I'm going to sit and I'm going to log in as them. So as far as you're aware, your sysadmin's like, oh, I've forgotten something at 6 p.m, I need to go and do something. And they're continuing on doing things. So how do you observe that as an attacker? Well, if you've got a standard baseline of what your sysadmins are doing, you can maybe spot that, but it can be very difficult to do. And equally, if you're an insider threat, you're going to do this over several months. You're not going to sit and like speedrun things in like 2 days. You're probably going to do it over 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, even a year. And one of the things I love is insider threat assessments is being inside client environments for like 6 months and spending the first 2 months just being a user. I'm not doing anything malicious. I just want to see what are your policies, what are these things. And in security, we hark on about having password policies, having documentation, having ISO 2001, 27001, whatever, having PCI. As an attacker, I love that documentation. I'm going to go into your SharePoint and I'm going to look for that information because I'm interested. What's your password policy? What's your minimum password time? What are all these things? How can I leverage that to my advantage and then access other systems? And then finally, I'm looking to my actions and objectives. So as an insider threat and an insider risk, there are a multitude of objectives that can be achieved from this. Typically, the kind of primary focus isn't on getting domain admin because your standard Bill or Jane from accounts isn't typically going to go for domain admin. If they are, that's probably an issue. You should probably look at that. They're typically going to look at potentially sensitive information, but these are the users that you want to apply your data loss prevention solutions to. So I'm thinking as an attacker, right, okay, these people access email. I wonder if I can upload files to email and not send them, and then log into that email somewhere else. So things that I've done in red teams is I'll upload a file to like a note in Outlook. It's not going anywhere, like I'm not sending it to anyone. Your outbound gateway is not detecting it. It's not going out the network. But then I'll go and log in somewhere else. I'll log in a virtual machine outside of your lockdown VDI, and I'll pull that file down. And as far as you're aware, the only log you've got is a file has been accessed in a note, and that's that. So it can be very difficult to spot. So the red versus blue in this action, in this scenario, you've got the red activity, and like we've said, it's not always focused on payloads. So I'm not always going to try and get command and control inside your environment. I'm not always going to drop malware to disk. Often, I want to kind of not exploit vulnerabilities either, and they're very difficult to spot. I want to be a malicious user. Actually, sometimes I just want to be a user and do things. Maybe I want to join your Teams call and put my camera off and just listen to what you're talking about. That's something that very sophisticated threat actors do, and we've seen like Scattered Spider and stuff like that do. Everyone's heard of Scattered Spider, quite a common threat actor group, where they will join calls and just listen to what's going on. They're not gaining anything potentially from joining that call initially, but they might have an understanding where you're discussing like your change window or these kind of things that could be useful to me as an attacker. If I'm performing attacks during a change window, that might be considered suspicious, whereas if I'm doing it at another time, then it's less suspicious. From the blue team perspective, how do you detect this activity? How do you spot it? Well, having an understanding of what your baseline for your users looks like is really key. Understanding that your sysadmins are accessing systems, they should be within times that are applicable. Maybe they're not logging in at 3 in the morning, or if they are, maybe give them a call and say, oh, hi, Brian, are you logging in at 3 in the morning? oh, sorry, I woke you up, you're not logging in at 3 in the morning, cool, let's go and investigate that. Making your MSSPs, your defensive provider, aware of these things as well. So one of the things that I was dealing with a client recently where we were doing a red team, and the client was acting as the kind of mediator, where they didn't tell the blue team what was going on, but they were just kind of the middle people. And the SOC called up the mediators, the white team, and they were like, oh, we've seen this activity, this service account's logging in, and the white team are just like, oh yeah, that's fine. It's IT being IT, it's standard. And it was only at the point where we decided to drop a payload to disk, where they went, I don't think this is IT being IT. This service account runs a nightly job, and it's all of a sudden remote desktop and RDPing across the environment, and it's magically dropped a file to disk. That looks a bit suspicious, so they contained the host. But having that insight and that incline to can do that, and also if you're an MSSP, looking at what is my sign-off from the client? If I spot suspicious activity, do I need to contact the client, or do I have the authorization to contain that host? Is it a domain controller? Is there multiple domain controllers? Like a good example of like kind of real-world attacks are, if you see suspicious activity on a domain controller and you're an MSSP, do you have the authorization to contain that domain controller? Like, if that domain controller has been compromised, do you have the authorization to flip the KRB TGT credentials? And if you don't, maybe you should have that discussion with the client. And equally, if you are an in-house defense team and you see this activity, what's your failover? Like, if your domain controller goes down, do you have a failover domain controller? If your KRB TGT password gets compromised, how do you do a mass domain password reset? How do you handle these things? So while it's important to do red team, blue team exercises, it's important to do property exercises, it's also important to do disaster recovery exercises where what happens if your systems go down? What happens if, I don't know, Windows updates and you're stuck in a boot loop or something like that? Or maybe you've got third-party software that pushes out updates and something breaks. We know how that happens. So having that understanding and having the ability to perform disaster recovery and understanding how these things are put together, it's really key, it's really, really important. So kind of stepping on, attackers' new tactics and improving blues techniques. There are new tools evolving. There's new tools evolving in the red team sphere all the time. And from a blue team perspective, it's important to keep on these things. You don't need to understand how they work, but having some form of a lab environment you can test these things out in is really important, because you want to not only understand, if you see that in your environment, what does that tool do? Oh, I've seen that on GitHub before, it does X, Y, and Z. Or I can see what the telemetry looks like. Equally, you want to pivot away from that linear thinking. So there's a very famous phrase called attackers thinking grabs, defenders thinking lists. And that was coined by a gentleman at Microsoft, I can't remember his name, from when Bloodhound came out, Bloodhound being a tool for Active Directory mapping. If you can pivot away from your linear thinking, you have a better understanding or broader understanding of what's going on in your environment. And then if you have that broader understanding, you have a better case of identifying threat active trends. And that's what you can gather from things like threat intelligence. So finally, ultimately, what we've hopefully learned from this talk is that red and blue should work in symphony together. Together we stop breaches. We're not one or the other. We're very much a case of we're working in tandem. Is there fixes in your environment that you can apply? Apply the fixes. It's an obvious thing, but it's something to think about. Is that not an option? Well, can you apply preventive controls to your environment? So if you see something, can you stop it? If the prevention can't be applied, maybe it's a mission critical system, what detections and triage processes can be applied to those systems to give you further insight into that environment? And then finally, it can be very difficult to spot anomalies inside your environment. So talking about the insider threat, understanding what the level of noise, standard noise, looks like in your environment is very important, because then you can differentiate anomalies, you can look at deltas, you can go down into the weeds and you can see what things are doing. So thanks for listening. You've been marked safe from the red team today. If you want to drop me an email or whatever, that's my CrowdStrike email, and I'm Zephyrfish on the internet. I don't think we've got any time for questions because I'm bang on 3 o'clock, so I'll be around afterwards if you've got questions, but thanks very much for listening.